Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Daly, and I have the pleasure of chairing this session, which is looking at the Ireland and the International Labour Organization. And Frances Devine has really set up the scene for us very, very effectively indeed. Just occurred to me, I didn't want to raise a question at the end, that Thomas McPartland was one of two Irish men who died in the first, in Geneva in the first decade, attending meetings. Tom Barrington, who was a statistician in the Department of Industry and Commerce and a senior official, very capable man, father of Donal and the late Tom Barrington, died of pneumonia in Geneva, and his body was sent back by freight train with a luggage label. His widow collected it at a station and was given the bill for the return of his remains. I hope that more generous treatment was given to the McPartland family. I'm delighted that we're having this session looking at marking the centenary of Ireland's accession to the League of Nations and the International Labour Organization, because it was a formative moment, not just for Irish individuals, women and men going out into Geneva to represent their country, but because we have forgotten the ambition of the League of Nations, of which the ILO is a part, to make the world a better place in the 1920s. It didn't necessarily succeed, but we have to look at the ambition that we saw there. And you could see it in some of what Frances has presented here today. One of the things that's very interesting about the ILO is the fact that it is recognizing that the labour movement is part of a global or an international, transnational movement and has to be given its own organisation structure to fulfil that. And that reflects the earlier traditions of the Socialist Congress, which have been running from the 1890s. It also reflects an awareness that World War I was only won with a lot of labour support and involvement. And there was a belief that they could make the world a better place for labour. It didn't always happen. The ILO is also very significant, to my mind anyway, in that it's the first international organisation known to me that sets up a separate women's division, which it does in the late 1920s by Albert Thomas, who was a French trade unionist. And from the beginning, and when it was set up, they put a woman, a French female trade unionist, in charge. So this again is very, very far-seeing. It's decades before you get departments for women's affairs, women's sections in organisations. The ILO did that. So I think it's great that we are looking at this today. Before beginning, I want to just draw your attention to some people who need to be thanked for supporting this conference. First of all, to Dublin City Council, and then to the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media, and to the Expert Advisory Group, which has supported it. I might say that Frances was very assiduous in emphasising at meetings of the Expert Advisory Group, on which I also served with Frances, the importance of this conference here today. So I think you need to thank Frances for ensuring that it got a very high level support within the organisation. At this point, I'm going to hand over to our two speakers, and both our speakers today have first-hand practical knowledge of the ILO. Both have worked in the organisation, and we're going to take them, Gerry is going to speak first. Gerry worked with the ILO for more than 20 years, and mainly internationally. And of great interest to us here today is he has written a book, which is for sale outside. I've just bought my copy, I haven't read it yet, needless to say, and it's called Irish Influence, Building the League of Nations and the International Labour Organization. And I'm not going to interrupt with the second introduction. The second speaker is Patricia O'Donovan, who probably needs no introduction to people in this room. She worked for many years with the Irish Congress of Trade Unions and with many of you who are sitting here this morning or this afternoon, and she also then from 2001 went to take very senior positions at the International Labour Organization. So we're in the hands of two experts, two people who know the ILO inside out, and we will begin, as I said, with Gerry, so please give him a round of applause and welcome to the stage.
President Higgins, Madam Higgins, ladies and gentlemen. My paper relates to the decade of centenaries and Ireland's early years in the international community. But first of all, I should say a few more words about Edward Phelan, because Francis Devine has given us quite a comprehensive background. As you know, he played a prominent role in the formation of the International Labour Organization at the Paris Peace Conference of 1919. In 1920, he was appointed as chief of the diplomatic division, and over the next 28 years, he progressed through the organization, becoming assistant director, deputy director, acting director in 1941, and he became the first director general in 1948, retroactive to 1941. Here we see Phelan in 1922 as part of what has been known as the Big Three. The director in the middle was Albert Thomas from France. The deputy director, Harold Butler, who succeeded Thomas in the 1930s, and Edward Phelan. That's Phelan at the beginning of his time with the ILO. And then we fast forward to 1948, and this was Phelan's last occasion, his last event speaking at the ILO, when he actually handed over the reins to David Morse, the newly elected Director General of the ILO at the San Francisco Conference of '48. Phelan's name is synonymous with the first 30 years of the ILO. He's the only Irish citizen to have led the ILO throughout its life. As we've heard, he was born in Tremor, and his family moved to Liverpool, where Phelan completed his education. In Liverpool, he developed a special interest in one of the local MPs, Terence Power O'Connor, T.P. O'Connor, the Irish nationalist, solitary member of the Irish Nationalist Party who was elected from the British mainland. Phelan followed the fortunes of the Irish Home Rule movement as it was striving for Ireland to have its own parliament in Dublin. In 1914, he joined the British Civil Service in what was to be the new Ministry of Labour, and shortly thereafter, war broke out. During the war, he kept a distant eye on events in his home country, from the failure of policy priority was to gain membership of the League of Nations. Cork-born former French Foreign Legionnaire Michael McWhite was dispatched to Bern as Ireland's representative in Switzerland, and in order to help Ireland achieve membership of the League. He met the ILO's director, Albert Thomas, who introduced him to Edward Phelan. He made such an impression on McWhite that McWhite wrote back to Department of External Affairs in Dublin and said, the ILO director had presented to him an Irishman of outstanding ability in the person of Edward Phelan, whose vast and comprehensive knowledge enabled him to coordinate the different services of Britain, France, and other continental countries, i.e. within the ILO. Early in 1922, an Irish delegation travelled to Paris for a World Congress on the Irish Race, organised by the Irish Republican Association of South Africa. Phelan accompanied the director to Paris with the aim of meeting the Irish delegation and encouraging them to join the ILO. This Paris meeting reinvigorated Phelan and his Irish roots. In fact, it was his first meeting with leaders from the country's independence movement. It was a homecoming for Phelan in two ways. Emotionally, by re-energizing his Irish roots, and more importantly, by providing opportunities for him to contribute to the development of the new Irish nation, albeit from a distance. He did not hesitate to offer his informal support to Ireland's efforts to join the League of Nations. Phelan followed up that meeting by lobbying the delegation with lots of documentation on procedures for League membership. His personalized letters ran to between 5 and 7 pages. Remember, we didn't have photocopiers, we didn't have emails. He had to prepare all of these letters individually and sent them along with various annexes. He wrote to leaders who had not been in Paris, including the President of the Executive Council, W.T. Cosgrave, various ministers, including the Minister of External Affairs and the Secretary to that department. And he was urging them to apply to the League for League membership in 1922. With the Dáil's decision to postpone application to the League until after the Constitution had been formalised, Phelan changed his strategy. He urged Ireland to join the ILO, as membership of the League was not a prerequisite for joining the ILO. ILO membership, in fact, was less complicated than applying to the League. He pointed out that in 1919, at the first conference of the ILO, Germany and Austria had been admitted, but they had not been admitted to the League of Nations. In 1923, the Free State applied to join the League and was admitted as a member on the 10th of September 1923, exactly 100 years ago. It was extremely convenient that membership of the League brought with it membership of the ILO. There was no reciprocal arrangement, but members of the League automatically became members of the ILO. Ireland's success in being admitted to the League of Nations is one of the final milestones in the decade of Centenaries, which covers many key developments in the birth of the new nation. Phelan's supportive efforts were not overlooked by the Irish delegation. Owen McNeill, who was Minister of Education and part of the delegation, reflected that, "I must put on record the invaluable assistance received throughout the League of Nations session from Mr. Edward Phelan, who has a remarkable knowledge of European politics and politicians and of technical matters connected to the League. He was always watchful for the advantage of Ireland. His advice never failed us and never misled us. He placed himself at our service until our departure. He and Mr. McWhite more than made up for our inexperience. And it's due to them that our delegation kept abreast of other delegations." At that time, Edward Phelan was a big man in Geneva. Not only was he the number 3 in the ILO, the third-ranking official, but he had also been elected as president of the International Club of Geneva. So he was very well known in the short period of time that he had been there, the 3 years that he had been there. Phelan continued to play an active and supporting role, working closely with Ireland's representative to the League, Michael McWhite, who by now had transferred to Geneva. Phelan, the international diplomat and former British civil servant, increasingly identified himself with the Irish Free State and was among the first to apply for Irish citizenship. Through its membership of the League, Ireland sought international recognition for the Anglo-Irish Treaty with Britain. Membership of the League actually required states to register all international treaties to which they were a party. And Ireland submitted the treaty as a legal instrument between 2 member states. Britain did not agree with this approach, claiming that the treaty was an internal arrangement between 2 states of the British Empire. Nevertheless, The League duly registered the treaty on the 11th of July, 1924. And once again, Phelan had played an important part in that process. Phelan's interventions were frequently unsolicited, often made over the head of or behind the back of McWhite, who was Ireland's official representative to the League. It must be remembered that Phelan was a high-ranking international civil servant who happened to be from Ireland, with no formal status in the Irish administration. This led to situations where the administration felt that Phelan had overstepped the mark. As Francis Devine already mentioned, there have been a number of conventions that were passed between 1919 and 1921. And those conventions had been adopted by the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland before Ireland became a free state. Phelan had written at great length with regard to a number of these conventions. He wrote to the Attorney General, to the President, and many others. He adopted a serious and inappropriate tone for someone who was actually outside of the government service, even going so far as to suggest sanctions against Britain. He stressed the implications that these arrangements had or would have on the status of the Free State. He felt that the fact that these conventions and treaties had been signed, they undermined the status of the state. He also raised these issues directly with Irish delegates who were coming to Geneva to participate in the League of Nations meetings. The administration's response to Phelan's concerns was that these had been adopted and ratified in respect of Great Britain and Ireland. They said that Mr. Phelan was wrong. He had a wrong impression of our position under the treaty. He seems to think that we're quite free to act as we please with regard to treaties and conventions made before the establishment of the Free State. And this, of course, is not the case. As time went by, Phelan's arguments and advice tended to be disregarded by the Irish leadership. Nevertheless, he maintained strong links with Ireland, including with the trade union movement. And once again, Francis has just mentioned that he actually participated in the Irish Trade Union Congress meetings in Galway and in Dublin. As the ILO's third-ranking official, he spoke at these trade union congresses. Most likely, he would have visited, paid courtesy calls on the politicians in Dublin as he was passing through. However, there remained occasions when the Irish administration was pleased to have Phelan as an interlocutor with the ILO. In 1926, when Ireland pledged to make a gift to the ILO for its new headquarters, they wrote to Phelan for assistance. The chosen gift was to be a stained glass window, to become known as the Geneva window, crafted by the renowned artist Harry Clarke. It depicts the literary works of various prominent Irish authors. On the eve of its dispatch to Geneva in 1930, the government intervened. The gift was deemed to be an unsuitable expression of Irish culture throughout. This was a manifestation of the increasingly Catholic influence throughout the state. Objections related to the lack of religious beliefs of some of the chosen authors, to illustrations of a lightly clad female, and I'm not sure if you can see these things, a glass of malt, and a bottle of Guinness, all of which were judged to be unsuitable impressions of the new nation. The window was never delivered. The artist died soon after, and the artwork now belongs in Miami, Florida, far from its intended resting place and far from Ireland. Phelan wore several hats in addition to his important position at the ILO. as well as his enthusiastic yet informal support for the Free State, Phelan wrote several learned articles, many of which appeared in the Irish Jesuit Quarterly Studies. The first of these appeared under the title, "The ILO, Its Ideals and Results." He reflected on the origins of the ILO and the League of Nations, the two major agencies at the center of the new wave of international organization. In 1926, he published an article in two parts, Ireland and the International Labour Organization. The first of these documented the contribution that Ireland and its delegates made to the ILO during its first 3 years of membership. In the second part, Phelan wrote of the significance that membership of the ILO was having on Ireland's integration into the international diplomatic community. He said, "No account of Ireland and the ILO would be complete, which did not deal with the way in which her rights have been exercised and obligations fulfilled. In the case of older states, they could easily adapt well-established procedures, whereas in the case of the Free State, the exercise of these rights and fulfillment of these obligations marked practically the beginning of her formal international activities, and they have therefore a special interest." He was outspoken in writing about Ireland's freedom from Britain and its newfound sovereignty. Emmett O'Connor has mentioned in the ILO book, he spoke about Phelan's article on the sovereignty of the Irish Free State, where here he made a strong defense for Ireland's sovereignty based on the country's membership of the League of Nations, its competence to make international treaties, and its ratification of 8 ILO conventions. Such prolific output showed Phelan as a self-styled advocate and polemicist for the new Irish state. His articles provided valuable insights into the role of small, recently established states, such as Ireland, in the contemporary context of international organization. By 1929, Michael McWhite was transferred to Washington as Ireland's representative to the United States, and his position was taken by Sean Lester from Carrickfergus in County Antrim. Lester was a journalist by profession, who since 1923 had worked in the communications department of External Affairs. Phelan welcomed Lester to Geneva and promised to do anything in my power to assist you to get to know the ropes. They became close friends and confidants, maintaining the same level of cooperation as had existed between McWhite and Phelan. Lester's first task in Geneva was to seek Ireland's election for a 3-year term as a non-permanent member of the League's Council. As on previous occasions, Phelan lent his support to the successful achievement of this goal. My recent book, there has to be a plug here somewhere, my recent book on the Irish influence, Building the League of Nations and the ILO, which is a very nice supportive message from President Higgins, thank you, is based around the working relationship and close personal friendship between Sean Lester and Edward Phelan. This was in addition to their respective roles in the League and the ILO. The book is essentially a human interest story with a multiplicity of important backdrops: 2 world wars, the evolution of the Irish state, the creation of the United Nations, and the onset of the Cold War. In 1932, a vacancy came up at Deputy Secretary General level in the League of Nations. Having served in Geneva for more than 12 years, Phelan was a veritable veteran of diplomatic circles in that city. He put his name forward as a candidate for the vacant position. On behalf of the Irish Free State, Lester spoke to the outgoing Secretary General in support of Phelan's candidacy, while also indicating that it was important for the best person to be selected for the job. In the event, Phelan was not successful. In May 1933, the ILO director, Harold Butler, requested Phelan to carry out a mission to the United States to seek increased engagement of the United States in the ILO. The United States had been determined never to join the League of Nations, but it hadn't decided completely on the ILO. During his mission to the United States, actually an occasion when the ILO was benefiting from Phelan's Irish connections. As following Phelan's consultation in the United States, they joined the ILO in 1934. They became known as the jewel in the crown of the ILO, United States membership. In 1934, Sean Lester was transferred to Danzig as the League of Nations High Commissioner to the Free City of Danzig. And he continued to maintain close contact with Phelan. Lester and Phelan were to have parallel careers within their respective organizations. Upon Lester's return to Geneva in 1937, he was appointed as the League's Deputy Secretary General. In 1938, as you've heard already, Phelan became Deputy Director of the ILO. This created a situation where Irish citizens were deputies, second in command of the two most significant international agencies. Their posts became even more important in 1940 when the League's Secretary General, Joseph Avenel, resigned in disgrace. The reins of the League fell into the hands of Lester as acting Secretary General. In 1941, Phelan's boss, John Gilbert Winant, the American, was appointed as the US Ambassador to the United Kingdom. Phelan also became ILO's acting director. It was somehow ironical that in 1940, Phelan's escape from Europe to North America had been facilitated by the Spanish border guards, who mistakenly thought that his ILO diplomatic passport was an Irish one, and that Phelan was the Irish ambassador. Because the guards were under strict instructions from Berlin not to let any personnel from international organizations pass through. With Lester in Geneva and Phelan in Montreal, they strived to maintain their personal and working relations. Needless to say, in wartime, that was quite difficult. Their correspondence became a mixture of personal news alongside sensitive interagency issues. The two designated leaders, both from Ireland, allowed for interorganizational frictions to be conducted in an atmosphere of mutual understanding and friendship, spiced with a bit of banter. Undoubtedly, this situation placed considerable strain on their friendship. At the end of World War II, the San Francisco Conference on International Organization of 1945 formalized the establishment of the United Nations, thus superseding the League of Nations. Any decision about the future of the ILO was left hanging in the meantime. The former ILO Director General, Guy Ryder, has referred to Phelan in the following way. Although one can see Phelan as a pure product of the British civil service, he was deeply Irish. He brought his personal talent and industry to the new task of international cooperation at around the same time when Ireland emerged as an international actor on the world scene. And the ILO was and has remained one of the stages on which this art of combining national sovereignty with global interdependence can excel. In 1996, following the demise of Phelan's widow, Fernand, almost 30 years after her husband, the Phelan links with Ireland took on a new guise. A significant portion of their estate was bequeathed to the National University of Ireland. Numerous postgraduate students in international law have benefited from Phelan bursaries. The NUI boardroom is named after Edward and Fernand Phelan. And the NUI and the ILO continue to cooperate on a series of what are known as the biennial Edward Phelan lectures, starting in 2013 with a lecture by Guy Ryder, and the second one was by none other than President Higgins, an excellent lecture. I was there for that. Also, our chair, Professor Mary Daly, was there in 2017, and the last one was given by the Taoiseach, the former Taoiseach, now Taoiseach Leo Varadkar, in 2022. So it was quite a life that Phelan had, and quite a legacy. Thank you. I hand over to Patricia.
Thank you very much, Gerry, and good afternoon, Unuchtron, Sabina Higgins, and good afternoon to everybody, and also to our chair here. I'm delighted to be participating in this session, which is part of the Decade of Centenaries, marking the 100th anniversary of Ireland joining the League of Nations and the International Labour Organization. Both France's and Gerry's presentations have focused on the early years of the ILO and what you could call the first chapter in the life of the ILO. But what I would like to do is now move us forward and take us into what I would call the next chapter of the evolution in the life of the ILO. And I want to look at two key developments which I believe had a profound effect on the role of the ILO and its evolution as an organization dealing with workers' rights. These developments, the question of decolonization, which of course accelerated in the 1950s and 1960s, and alongside it, the emergence of the Cold War, both challenged the modus operandi of the ILO, which had been established in its first 25 years of its existence. That was basically a US Western European view of the world. At times, the combined effect of decolonization and the emergence of the Cold War actually threatened the credibility of the ILO and its capacity to function. One of the last and most significant achievements of Edward Phelan before his retirement was the adoption of the Declaration of Philadelphia in 1944. It basically reasserted the original aims and purposes of equality. Of race, creed, or sex, have the right to pursue both their material well-being and their spiritual development in conditions of freedom and dignity, of economic security and equal opportunity. It went on to call for the promotion of the social advancement of the less developed regions of the world, the first time that any attention was paid to the question of the less developed regions of the world. And it stated that these principles are fully applicable to all peoples everywhere. So again, revolutionary language for 1944. At the end of the war, the ILO was, as Gerry has pointed out, the only operational international entity, the League of Nations basically existed in name only. Despite this, Edward Phelan was sidelined in the discussions which led to the establishment of the post-war international framework. And in fact, in Gerry's book, he raises the question about the extent to which this might have been linked to the fact that Edward Phelan was an Irishman. And of course, the neutrality of Ireland during the war meant that none of the victors would have been happy with engaging with an Irishman in terms of the post-war international framework. Francis Perkins, who was the US Secretary of Labour under President Roosevelt from 1933 to 1945, in fact, she is the first woman to hold a cabinet position in the US administration. She had played a key role in the US decision to join the ILO in 1934, and indeed worked hard to ensure its support for the ILO during the war years. But now in the post-war scenario, she was no longer a member of the Truman administration, and there was also strong opposition from the USSR to the ILO. So in the immediate post-war scenario where the international framework was being considered, there was considerable uncertainty about whether the ILO would even continue after the war and whether or not there would be a place for it in the new post-war international framework. But President Truman delegated Francis Perkins to lead the US delegation to the International Labour Conference, which was held in Paris in 1945. And crucially, she reaffirmed, and I quote, that the settled policy of the US government is to seek for the ILO a proper place within the framework of the United Nations. With this crucial political backing from the US, the ILO was then designated in 1946 as the first specialized agency of the newly created United Nations. The ILO maintained its autonomy in relation to governance and policy matters, and in fact achieved financial independence, which it did not have under the League of Nations. So at the end of the war, the ILO was effectively repackaged as a specialized agency under the wider umbrella of the United Nations. In addition to gaining financial independence, it crucially maintained its unique tripartite structure. It returned from Montreal to its headquarters in Geneva in 1947 and started a new post-war chapter. David Morse, as already mentioned by Gerry, from the United States, took over from Edward Phelan as Director General in 1948. When he took up office, he stated that his main task was, and I quote, to rebuild an organization which has run down during the Second World War. It had survived, but it had not yet found a firm footing in the post-war world. Morse was a labour law expert and was General Counsel to the National Labour Relations Board in the United States. He served in Europe during the war, and at the end of the war was involved in preparing plans for re-establishing labour relations in Germany and Italy. He was an internationalist, a liberal, and a product of the New Deal era, who believed in government intervention to steer economic and social development. Morse served as Director General of the ILO for 22 years, from 1948 to 1970. He was, in fact, the longest-serving Director General in the history of the ILO, and his tenure covered the turbulent period during which decolonization and the emergence of the Cold War directly impacted the ILO. I want to look now at the main impact of decolonization on the ILO. The most visible impact, of course, was the significant increase in the number of member countries joining the ILO. membership grew from 55 member states at the end of the war to 121 in 1969. These newly independent countries, like Ireland in 1923, saw membership of an international organisation as an important assertion of their newfound sovereignty. Their membership, in fact, transformed the ILO into a global organisation and reoriented its primary focus away from the problems of industrialised countries to address questions of economic and social development in developing countries. Morse believed that the ILO was well placed to steer the economic and social development of these countries in a way that would counteract the pull of the Soviet Union. Bear in mind that the USSR had strong political ties with many of the former European colonies, particularly in Africa, as it championed their liberation movements. The Declaration of Philadelphia's reference, which I already mentioned, to the economic and social advancement of the less developed regions of the world, now gave the ILO the mandate that it needed to expand its technical assistance programs to influence the economic and social models being developed by these newly independent countries. Based on his New Deal experience in the US and later the Marshall Plan in the reconstruction of Europe, David Morse and the ILO under his leadership was instrumental in developing and implementing a strategy of integrated economic and social development in these countries. At its core was a focus on promoting policies to create employment based on respect for the fundamental principles of freedom of association, collective bargaining, and equality. Even though never explicitly stated, this model of development was designed to provide a counterweight to the communist model advocated by the Soviet Union. The ILO continued to set minimum standards for the world of work during these years. Indeed, during the first decade after the war, 5 out of the ILO's 8 core conventions were adopted. These core conventions covered issues such as freedom of association, the right to organize, collective bargaining, equality, and the abolition of forced labor. However, most ILO resources now shifted to technical cooperation as the ILO expanded its network in developing countries, delivering technical advice and support to their governments, employers, and trade unions. The integrated approach of economic and social development promoted by the ILO, and indeed by the UN more widely in these years, was the driving force, and to some extent still is, behind modern development policy, applicable not just to developing countries, but also to developed economies. In Ireland, for example, this integrated model was reflected in the establishment of institutions such as the Economic and Social Research Institute in 1960 and the National Economic and Social Council in 1973. Here is a fact that is not that well known, but in 1969, the ILO was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize on its 50th anniversary in recognition of its contribution to peace and social justice. Among those who nominated the ILO for the prize was the then Taoiseach, Jack Lynch. His letter of nomination referred to the ILO's, I quote, impressive achievement in the interests of world peace, promoting social justice and human rights. When David Morse left the ILO in 1970, it was profoundly changed from the organisation that he took over in 1948 from Edward Phelan. It was no longer a US, Western European dominated organisation. It had achieved global reach and recognition for its work with the award of the Nobel Peace Prize. It had established itself as an effective operational agency, delivering technical support to developing countries, while maintaining its core function of setting minimum standards for the world of work. But Morse also left behind a deeply troubled and divided ILO, as the tensions of the Cold War found their way into the organization. Let me now turn to this issue. The readmittance of the Soviet Union as a member of the ILO in 1954 effectively brought the Cold War into the heart of the organization. The USSR had originally joined in 1934, but was expelled from the League of Nations in 1939 because of its invasion of Finland. During the initial years of its ILO membership in the 1930s, questions were raised about the independence of the employer and trade union representatives from the Soviet Union. Indeed, the Soviet Union itself was less than enthusiastic about the ILO, seeing its tripartism as a form of corporatism. By the time it rejoined the ILO in 1954, the tensions of the Cold War were palpable, and it did not take long for the old questions to resurface. On the other hand, the US had joined the ILO in 1934, its only international affiliation at a time when it was adamantly isolationist. It could be argued that it was the steadfast support of the US, particularly during the war years and immediately after, that had guaranteed the ILO's survival. Because of its commitment and engagement, the influence of the United States in the ILO remained strong in the post-war period, not least of all as it was by far the largest contributor to the ILO budget, which, by the way, it remains to this day. However, the Soviet Union, the Eastern Bloc countries, and many of the newly affiliated developing countries now created a formidable alliance which challenged the dominant position which the US and the Western European countries had enjoyed until now in the ILO. Of course, many of the ILO's stated aims and purposes are intrinsically political, and they provided fertile ground for Cold War ideological and political disagreement. Also, the tripartite structure of the ILO made it particularly susceptible to Cold War politics, with the trade union representatives subject to pressures from competing ideological factions within and outside their organizations. As key industrial and political actors, trade unions were drawn into the tensions of the developing Cold War, and the ideological divisions were mirrored in trade union structures. The World Federation of Trade Unions, established as a unified trade union organization in 1945, split along Cold War lines in 1949. Most trade union centers in Europe, as well as the US, left the WFTU and established the International Confederation of Free Trade Unions. The WFTU continued to represent trade unions from the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc countries, as well as communist-affiliated unions in other regions. This included some significant trade unions in Western Europe, in countries such as Italy and France. The World Confederation of Labour was also part of the international trade union landscape. These global trade union organizations played a key role in the ILO because they managed, if that's the right word, they managed the elections of the workers' representatives to the governing body, and they influenced the policies pursued by them in the ILO. It is worth noting here that the Irish Congress of Trade Unions was not affiliated to any of these international trade union organizations. It maintained, I think, what you could call a kind of a non-aligned status. This may reflect the more pragmatic approach taken by Irish trade unions to the wider ideological debates that preoccupied the international trade union movement. In the ILO, the Cold War divisions led to increased tensions, which surfaced at all levels of the organization, particularly in relation to its work in developing countries, where the Soviet Union and the US vied with each other for influence. The US, particularly its National Trade Union Center, the AFL-CIO, pursued a strident anti-communist strategy at the ILO. European trade unions took a more relaxed view, as many of them coexisted with communist-led trade unions at national level, and did not share what many of them regarded as the overzealous anti-communism of the AFL-CIO. In 1975, the US tripartite delegation walked out of the International Labour Conference when the Palestinian Labour Organization was granted observer status. Led by George Meany, Irish-American, president of the AFL-CIO, who saw himself as a leading Cold War warrior, this anti-communist crusade culminated in the withdrawal of the US from the ILO in 1977. While this withdrawal was short-lived, the US actually rejoined the ILO in 1980. This episode marked a low point in the post-war history of the ILO. At a very practical level, it had an immediate impact on the capacity of the ILO to function, as its budget was severely cut. It also tarnished the reputation of the US in the international arena and diminished the historical role that it had played in the survival of the ILO. This was recognized indirectly in the US letter of withdrawal when it acknowledged, and I quote, that American relations with the ILO are older and perhaps deeper than with any other international organization. Interesting enough, this letter of withdrawal was signed by no other than Henry Kissinger, who then was the Secretary of State. The proposed US withdrawal from the ILO gave rise to an interesting exchange in Dáil Éireann in February 1976, as Garret Fitzgerald questioned the then Minister for Labour, Michael O'Leary, about the purpose of a recent visit by him to the US. The minister replied that the purpose of the visit, and I quote, was to indicate our point of view that the US withdrawal from the ILO would severely weaken the effectiveness of that organization. It would be contrary to the consistent policy of support for the ILO pursued by all Irish governments over the years if we failed to make an effort to prevent the breaking up of the ILO that would follow implementation of the US threat. Unfortunately, the minister failed to convince at least one of his Dáil colleagues of the importance and necessity of his visit. Ray Burke called it a junket to America, concluding that it is a tourist we have, not a minister for Labour. While some reforms were introduced by the ILO to facilitate the US return in 1980, the fundamental divisions of the Cold War continued to impact the functioning of the ILO through to the end of the 1980s, only really coming to an end with the fall of the Berlin Wall. In my view, the divisive pressures created by the Cold War conflict as it played out in the ILO undermined its authority as an independent and authoritative voice on global labour matters. Of course, the ILO continued to function during these difficult years. And for example, in 1975, it produced an important report on the Irish trade unions, the Shragley report on the rationalisation of the Irish trade union movement. But the Cold War manoeuvres sapped ILO resources and eroded its moral authority. But you could argue that there was a silver lining for the ILO to these difficult years, as the Cold War was forced to find ways to work around political and ideological divisions. This led to the development of the ILO's hallmark approach to resolving conflicts through dialogue and consensus building rather than confrontation. I believe that this is what mainly enabled the ILO to survive the challenges of the post-war period. I want to conclude my presentation by returning to 1923 and the first Irish delegation to the ILO. As already mentioned by Frances, the only woman on that delegation was Bridget Stafford. I'm afraid it's not a great picture, but it's the only one I could find. She attended the ILO as an Irish government representative for several years after the 1923 conference. In fact, her final attendance was in 1947, when she chaired the committee which drafted the Convention on Labour Inspection. In a paper she presented to the Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland in 1953, Bridget Stafford described the ILO as, and I quote, "a powerful machine of unprecedented character, unprecedented because of so many breaks with tradition, of which the most radical was the representation of employers and workers with equal rights with government representatives and the adoption of conventions by a two-thirds majority. These were revolutionary breaks with age-old traditions of the principles of state sovereignty and unanimity in international conferences." I think that Bridget Stafford captured very well the revolutionary nature of the ILO then and now. Chair, I just want to conclude with this slide on the graphic that I have been using, which is a section of the mural painted by Sean Keating and presented as a gift by the Irish government to the ILO in 1961. Fortunately, it had a better fate than the Geneva window. It was successfully presented and in fact has been beautifully restored in what is now the WTO building in Geneva. And if you ever have the opportunity to go and see it, it's a beautiful piece of artwork. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to both our speakers. We've had two extraordinarily rich, thoroughly researched papers that are very complimentary, and I've learned so much from them. I hope the rest of you have as well. Do we have a roving mic? Okay, great. So are there any questions? This, I think, is going to be historic for me, but the first conference where we're ahead of time. So, and I've been at many conferences in my day. So if you want to ask a question, can you put up your hand and wait until the mic reaches you? Okay? Yeah, fine.
First of all, I'd like to thank the two speakers.
And if you could identify yourself as well.
Shay Cody, President of the Labour History Society, and also Frances's introduction. I just want to make a few observations about, I suppose, the role of the labour movement in all of this. And before there was an ILO, Frances made mention of the visit of the Irish Trade Union Congress and Labour Party to Bern to the conference in 1919. And a report of that is now up on the Labour History Society website. But the significant dimension to that was that Tom Johnson and Cathal O'Shannon met with the leadership of the revolutionary Dáil in advance of it. So they met Michael Collins, they met Richard Mulcahy, they met Rory O'Connor, with a view to articulating a separate and distinct Irish voice in international labour circles. And that was part of what they went for. Their submissions were in Irish, English and French. They're published in the booklet that was there. And on their way back from Bern, they met with Sean T. O'Kelly, who was the Dáil Éireann representative attempting to lobby the Versailles Conference in Paris and seeking an audience with Woodrow Wilson to try and get a separate Irish voice. And Frances made the point that one significant development that took place in the Bern Conference was the British Trade Union and Labour delegation accepted that the Irish delegation was from a separate state and it was a separate voice from the UK, which obviously wasn't the legal situation in 1919. And they moved the policy position of the British labour movement from being in favour of home rule for Ireland ILO, and was brought back to Ireland in 1948 to become the first chairperson of the Labour Court. So the dimension of that tripartite model within the ILO came back into the Labour Court, which has, government nominated people, trade union nominated people, and employer nominated people, basically problem solving in the industrial relations environment in Ireland. So there's a circle around all of this, from the visit to Bern to the appointment of Mortished in 1948, that really resonates with the history of the Irish labour movement and the history of the trade union movement. So thank you for those.
And thank you for that. That was very interesting. Do our panel want to make any comment? No. Any further questions here? Yes, there's one here, over the front. Just could you wait? Great, microphone coming.
Marcel van der Linden. What I want to say is more about the present situation of the ILO. Is that okay?
Oh, please.
Yes, because I think the ILO at the moment is in deep trouble. And in fact, the last speaker already hinted a bit at that. And that has a number of reasons, I think. And one is that the tripartite structure of the ILO is very logical in a Fordist context, in the context of capitalist growth, in which the consumption of the working class is contributing to the profits of capital. So there's a circular system. But since the 1980s, we have seen a decline of the labor share in most economies in the world. So this means that the period before it was always very constant. So we see that capital is gaining terrain while labor is losing terrain. And this is a consistent thing for the last 40 years at least. So that means that that employers are less interested in what unions have to say in the ILO. And a second thing is that with the rise of neoliberalism, also since the 1980s, other forces have become important that are in disagreement with the ILO, especially the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the OECD. And the World Bank has 6 times as much money as the ILO, and IMF 3 times, as, I think, something like that. And we see that in the 1990s especially, the initiative for policy measures has moved from the ILO to IMF and World Bank. For instance, in the question of pensions, always ILO was the institution that was consulted by governments as the most important consultant. In the 1990s, especially late 1990s, you get these reports from the World Bank and so, which try to liberalize pension policies, and the ILO is slow and only 7 years later produces its own report. And after, in that time, they had already lost a lot of their influence. So, and all this combined with the weak and weakened influence of the ILO in the implementation of conventions. The number of conventions is now 190. And by the way, although we may say that the United States was important in the ILO, they have only ratified 14, and 12 of those are still valid. So they don't like conventions so much, they like technical assistance, which then also became very important under David Morse, and in fact led to the fact that about 40% of the budget of the ILO was not real budget, but came from outside. So outside forces gained influence on the policy of the ILO since the 1960s, or maybe 50s. So And this all together with the decreasing number of conventions that have been adopted, the last 10 years there was only 2, means that, and the conventions, once they are adopted, they cannot be implemented. If governments ratify and then they don't do what they promise to do, there is no punishment, except for very weak governments, like Myanmar. If the United States adopts something and they don't implement it, then nobody can punish them. So that's a bit the conundrum at this moment for the ILO, I think.
Yeah. I think I'll call on Patricia, who to perhaps make a few comments on this, because you've experienced a lot of this aspect.
Yes, and I mean, of course, the situation is changing all the time, and certainly the World Bank and the IMF play an outsized role in terms of the financial global market and the economic issues. But I wouldn't really agree with you that the ILO has been weakened substantially. Its strength at its core is its tripartite structure, and that is something which gives it a legitimacy and authenticity in terms of its views on the world of work, all aspects of the world of work, and its technical capacity to respond to issues. I mean, it's interesting what you say. Its reports only come out, 5-6 years after OECD or what. But its reports are from a different perspective and have a legitimacy because it has a process of consultation and dialogue which engages the world of work, trade unions and employers. Employers never really liked what the ILO did. I mean, that goes without saying, or the business world. But the ILO is a structure which, if you like, requires engagement from them. And they do engage. I mean, the ILO is active on the global stage. It does, for example, it will participate in global meetings of the G20 and so on, and its presence is important. So I understand what you're saying. I would say the role of the ILO is continuing to change and to adapt, but at its core, its strength remains its tripartite structure and the representation and the voice of labour, because it's not about the formal trade union movement only. The ILO speaks, I think, with a wider voice and a more legitimate voice than it has had in the past.
Thank you. Yes,
I could just add to that, Mary.
If you get a microphone. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to add.
Gerry,
Just to add to what Patricia was saying, the ILO was applying was listening to the voice of civil society before the term was ever invented. As Patricia said, from 1919, you had the voice of workers, you had the voice of employers coming together with government. That was unheard of at that time. And it's only in the past 50 years that the UN has really been opening up to a range of voices coming from society. So I think that's a very strong point. Now, not only that, from the very early stages, the ILO as an organization recognized that the voice of workers was not necessarily very united, and it was not very strong. And they set up a Bureau of Workers' Activities to strengthen the voice of workers across the globe. The same with the employers, so that they didn't just jump up from time to time. They had a systematic way of dealing with issues, and that's still very strong within the ILO through the tripartite mechanism. You have to bear with me. I have severe hearing loss, so I'm trying to pick up on what Patricia was saying. Thank you.
Just about a tripartite structure. At this moment, the world labor force, according to the ILO itself, is something bit more than 3 billion, and the total number of organized workers in trade unions, excluding the Chinese trade unions who nobody considers to be trade unions, is about 200 million. So union density on a global scale now is about 6%. Yeah, and it was 7% in 2014 when the International Trade Union Confederation had its Congress in Berlin, and it has been decreasing for a long time now. So large part, the very largest part of the world working class is not organized in unions. In India, for instance, 92% of the workers are not in the formal sector and therefore not in unions. The problem, one of the problems with the structure of the ILO is that only workers are represented through unions. And I was a few years ago, there was a high-level conference in Geneva at the ILO that Guy Ryder organized, where it was present. And where we talked about this. How can we solve this problem? Most increasing numbers of workers in the world are informally working. So they have no standard contract, they change employers every week, sometimes they shift to petty commodity production or whatever. So they cannot be part of collective bargaining, for instance, also. So they are all excluded. How can you think of a structure in which these informally working workers are organized?
With the ILO, though, because I've always thought that it failed to get to the family labour, the peasant workers, and particularly when you go into the developing countries, so many of the workers would have been in informal family-related occupations where they can be exploited dreadfully, as we all know. So I think that's actually not. It may be a recent problem, but I think it's a historical one that was there from the beginning. It's the one thing that's always struck me about the ILO, that there was this whole family economy, agrarian economy where an awful lot of women worked that was not being captured by the remit. So I think that this is a very big issue. Are there any other questions, comments from over that way? Yeah, great.
John Martin, I find this very interesting, but my view of where we are, including the ILO and other organizations, that most people outside this section of society do not know what the ILO or other organizations are, or what the World Bank does. What I want to see going forward, and this, I was at the Desmond Crevice school a couple of weeks ago, and I have come to this because when I seen the sections and I seen the people would be involved and the areas that would be discussed, I believe this is what we want. A great friend of mine in Dublin Corporation, Peter Noctor, when we were having these conversations many years ago, enlightened me on something that certainly if you have your opinions, you think everybody else should be immediately able to get your opinions and your positions on anything, no matter where it comes from activists or academia or anywhere else. He said to me, he said, John, he said, each generation only lives within its own lifetime. And that certainly impressed me. What we have to do, and we have to do it very shortly, time is against us, we have to determine where we are, the trade union movement, all the other social justice organizations, where do we stand in the 21st century, in the fourth industrial revolution, in the economic politics, the climate change. Where are we in the 21st century? How can we put the organizations together worldwide in order for us to be able to set up a program and a strategy that we can actually work on that. I, at a meeting in Desmond, said that I would give a reference to the globalism, to the 1 and 10%. If they ask me for a reference to them on what they have done since 1970, I would say that they have won hands down, and we on this side of the coin, unfortunately, have lost out absolutely. To me, the trade union movement, as I know it, was the trade union movement up to 1970 and 1908, and many other organisations such. We have given a lot of ground over those years. We will have to take it back. But the only way we'll take it back is when we have a strategy, both nationally and worldwide, that we can all do. We can't do this on ourselves in Ireland or on 4 or 5 nations. The famous thing of Marx said, you cannot have communism in one country. You cannot have social justice in one country either.
Thank you. I think that brings us back very much to some of what Marcel was saying in his paper, and I think also to what Patricia was saying about the need for flexibility and adaptability of organisations. Are there any questions? There's the hand up down there, middle of. Yeah. It's the microphone's coming. There's somebody here. Yeah. Okay. Sorry. Is there? Am I missing somebody as well? Okay, fine. Yeah, and are there 2 more as well?
There's one up at the back.
Okay, so I think we'll take people who've put their hand up by now and leave it then. Yes, far ahead.
Hands up. Here.
Many thanks. I'd like to go back to a phrase that was used by the first speaker when he mentioned Fordism and the introduction of Fordism. And many people lived through the introduction of the moving assembly line, which was known as Fordism, and the breakdown of the divisions of labour, the technical divisions of labour. I think from where I stand, as you know, a labour.
Excuse me, could you speak up, please?
I'm sorry, I didn't know. Okay, unaccustomed as I am. That I'd just like to bring up the question again of the impact on that tripartite structure of the diminishing of skill embodied in human labour, basically. And the first speaker mentioned, just in passing from this floor rather than the podium, the question of Fordism. And I think that it would be very profitable if we could look at the way in which specific skills were actually broken down over a long period of time. So, for example, you know, there's a common example, the jean machine. People used to know how to make a pair of jeans. By the end of, you know, the moving assembly line, the technical divisions of labour, people didn't know how to make a pair of jeans anymore. They knew how to put a pocket on. And that was the grand sum of their labour. And I think if to look at the weakening of what labour has, the potential of labour, you have to perhaps, before we totally come to, and you know, this is a bit dramatic, to AI, you know, that we recognise that a lot of what the part of the tripartite agreements that labour brought to the table was diminished by the breaking down of skills. Now, I'm not Luddite, but I think that you have to have something to negotiate with. And too often, I think, and I think the trade union movement has to take some responsibility for this, that when redundancies were brought to the table, it was almost an individual contract, rather than what is the impact on the following generation of working people if you negotiate away your position in the labour force for a redundancy package. Okay. It's a complex area, but I think that history has maybe not looked at that sufficiently.
Okay.
to come up with maybe a different kind of angle.
Okay, thank you very much. Do either of you comment on that? No. There were other hands that were up. Perhaps we could. Okay, great.
Up here, if I may.
Okay, great. Yeah, please.
This is one for Patricia. She mentioned the nature of the involvement or the attitude of the Soviet Union and indeed of the United States. I'm kind of curious to know about the level and nature of involvement of the Russian Federation in the ILO over, we'll say, the last 20 years. Thank you.
Well, I would have to say that, I mean, when the Berlin Wall came down, the change in the ILO was very obvious in the sense that up until that time, and I used to attend the ILO actually as part of the Irish tripartite delegation for a number of years, and pre-1989, you essentially had a block vote with the Soviet Union and the countries, Eastern Bloc countries and other associated countries at the ILO, which effectively, from the point of view of the workers group, was quite favourable because almost always this bloc would vote with the workers group, and it was quite, you know, in terms of discussions around conventions and so on, you could rely on having the support of this bloc of countries. The workers' group could rely on them in terms of voting through resolutions or amendments, conventions and so on that they would be proposing. That essentially broke down after the 1989, and the Russian Federation took its place alongside other individual countries with their representatives from business and trade unions, and continued, if you like, in a diminished, I would say, a diminished role in terms of its influence at the ILO. Having said that, it clearly came with what was considered to be a much more democratic role, certainly in the 1990s. And you had, of course, then the emergence of the sort of independent trade unions from many of the previous Eastern Bloc countries, including Solidarność from Poland and so on. And they were very active in the ILO, and in fact the ILO played a very key role in the recognition of these independent trade unions which then emerged. But the Russian Federation, I think, continued to be an active member of the ILO, continued to participate in its activities, but compared to its its Cold War days, if you like, it was a much diminished presence politically at the ILO. At least that would have been my observation. I think it's, as the Chinese famously said about the French Revolution, it's probably too early to say what its impact will be over time. And of course, I'm no longer working for the ILO, and what its presence is like at the moment, I'm not in a position to say how it's functioning right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
A very interesting question, very interesting answer. Were there any other hands up that we've missed? If not, I think we will draw this session to a close. It's been remarkably lively and stimulating, and we've had two quite outstanding papers. And again, can I also add my thanks to Francis for setting the scene so beautifully for us. So could you please give a round of applause to this wonderful group? Thank you very much, and there is tea outside, I hope. There is tea outside, I've been assured.
Colleagues, given that you've been so well behaved, we're going to extend the tea and coffee break. So can we be back here at 5:25 so as we can begin again at 5:30?